Hey, welcome back to Code Chunks. Today I'm going to be introducing you to JavaScript Variables and Types. So let's get started. So if you're new to programming in general, you don't know what a variable is. So when you're writing a program, your application, it needs to keep track of something, it needs to remember something. And so that's what variables are really used for. Um, if you need to remember or store, let's say, a number, a birthday, or a name, that needs to be stored in a variable so that way you can access that later. And that's pretty much what a variable is in the most simplistic form or explanation. Now, how do you use variables in JavaScript, and what are the ways that you can store information in a variable? I'll show you how to do that. So there's three different types for storing a variable in JavaScript as of ES6. So there's one which is called var, which just stands for variable, and that's what was originally in JavaScript. And so var is what you write when you want to store or create a variable rather, and then you type the name of the variable. So in this case, it can be test, okay? And then you do equals, and then whatever you want to store in the test variable. So in this case, we can do 1, 2, 3, okay? Then you add a semicolon to indicate that that's the end of the line, and that's that. Now with ES6, there's an introduction of two additional types for storing variables in JavaScript, and that's called let and const. So let is very similar to var in the sense that you can store a variable. So we can call this one name. You can set this to code chunks, okay? And then const, we can do age, for example, and we can do, I don't know, 43, okay? So you might be asking yourself, what's the difference between these three? So var, like I mentioned, is from the original versions of JavaScript, and that's that. Now with let and const, there's something that these take into consideration that's called scoping and hoisting, and I'll talk about that in a future video. But basically, if you have a block of code with vars, with the var variable type, you can access the test variable anywhere in your application. Okay, but with let and const, they're called they're block scoped, which means that they're scoped to a specific chunk or area within your application or within your code, and they can only be accessed within that block or within that chunk of code. And that's what really makes them powerful, and that's something that a lot of developers had been asking for a very long time, and that's what they introduced with ES6. Now, what's the difference between let and const? So let and var are pretty much the same, with the exception of that scoping and hoisting that I just talked about. Now, const is const stands for constant, right? So the idea behind const is that it's a variable that cannot or should not be changed once it's been set. And so if I were to do age is equal to 19, for example, when I run this file, it should complain because I shouldn't be able to reset a constant variable to something else. Now, there is a caveat to this, and I'll talk about this in a second, but that's pretty much the three different types of variables that you can create in JavaScript. Okay, so if you're familiar with programming, maybe you've used a language like Java, right? That's like a pretty popular beginner programming language. You'll be familiar with something called types. So Java is a strongly typed programming language. Now, what does that mean? In Java, you can have a variable that's specifically set to be equal to a string, or you can have variables specifically set to a number. And those variables cannot be of different types. Now, JavaScript is a loosely typed programming language. Now, what does that mean? That means that I can set variables, a variable to say a number on one line, and then a string to another, and then a Boolean to another. Now I'll show you what I mean by that. So let's declare a variable, okay? Let's call it test, okay? Now on line 1, let's set test to 1, 2, 3, okay? Now that is, oops, that's a number, okay? Now on line 2, I can set test to a string, okay? I can do code chunks, okay? Now that's a string. And then I can set test to a Boolean. And if you're not familiar with programming, a Boolean is either true or false. And that's all a Boolean is. And I can set test to false, and that's that. And JavaScript is totally okay with this. If you were to use a strongly typed programming language like Java, then it would yell at you and say that you're not allowed to do this, but in JavaScript you can, and that's what makes JavaScript powerful, but also makes it kind of annoying to some developers. And so there's some type systems that have been developed that introduce typing to JavaScript. That's the most popular one is called TypeScript, and that's developed by Microsoft. And there's also Flow by Facebook. And if you want to learn more about those, you can go to the websites and learn more about those. But for just plain vanilla JavaScript, that's what the types are. Now, if you still are kind of unclear about this and how this works, I'll show you real quick. So in JavaScript, you can print out stuff to the console, which is like your terminal basically. And you do that by typing console.log, okay? And then you can either put a string or you can put anything in here. In this case, let's do test, okay? And specifically, let's do type of, okay? So type of is, in JavaScript, will let you know what the type of a variable is, okay? So when we run this, it should say number, okay? Now, once we set test to code chunks, it should say string. And once we set it to false, it should say Boolean, okay? Now, let's just run this real quick. Now, you can open up a terminal in VS Code by holding down Command-Shift-P, opening a new integrated terminal, okay? I'm just going to navigate to where this file is. It's on my desktop, and you should have Node installed. So all you have to do is Node and then variables, okay? Variables.js, that's the name of this file. Click enter to run, and that's what we see. We see number from this first line, okay? Which means that test is equal to 1, 2, 3, which is a number. Then we set test to code chunks, and it says that it's a string. And then we set test to false, and it tells us that that's a Boolean. That's that. Now there is one type I forgot to mention, and that's called an object. And that's something that you'll see all over the place in JavaScript. Now, what is an object? An object is something that can contain multiple keys and values. Now that might not make a whole lot of sense. Let me just delete this. Let's just make a new test variable, okay? And we're going to set that equal to an object. Now, the way you create or define an object, most cases is just open, close curly brace. That's it, okay? You can also do object.create, but just for simple JavaScript, it's just curly brace, okay? Now, you can create key and value pairs within an object and then access those key value pairs. Okay, let me rename this to person, okay? Now, if I want to create a name property for this person object, the way you do that is you set the key to name, okay? So I just type name, I do colon, okay? And then I put the value after the colon. So the value for name is, and this can be any of the types, so it can be a string, it can be a number, it can be a Boolean, it can be another object, or it can also be an array. I'll talk about arrays in a second too. And in this case, let's set it to a string, okay? Let's just do code chunks. And let's say I want to add an age property, key value property to person. The way you add another key value property is by adding a comma to the end of the first line, okay? I do age, okay, just like the line above, colon, and in this case, let's just do 47, okay? And if I want to add another key value property, I can do another comma, and we can do address, okay, colon. I'm going to do a string. It's going to be Earth. Oops, if I can spell. There you go, Earth. Okay, and that's that. That's pretty much what an object is, and you can have them nested. So you can have an object within an object. Okay, and here you can see it's yelling at me because I forgot to add a colon, or sorry, not a colon, a comma to the last one. And then I could do something else. I could do whatever, hello and world, okay? And that's pretty much how you create an object in JavaScript. Now, how do you access these properties within an object? Let's just make a new console.log statement, okay? Let's type person. Now, say I want to access the name of person. Let's do person.name, and that's that. Now, if I open my terminal again, okay, and I go back to my desktop and I type node variables, enter, there is the name printed, right? Let's say I want to do the age. I can save that, okay, run that file again, and there you go. It shows me my age. That's not how old I actually am, but yeah, that's that. That's an object in JavaScript. Now let me show you what an array is. Let's just clear this file real quick. Okay, so what is an array? An array basically is a list, I guess if you will, in JavaScript. You can store multiple things in an array, in a list. I'm sorry, an array is pretty common term, I guess, across all programming languages. So let's just do let me do list of names, okay, equal, and let's set this to an array. Now, the way you create an array is by putting square brackets. So we do open, close square brackets, okay? And now you can start adding things to your array. Now I can just do any of the types. I could do booleans, I could do objects, I could do another array, I could do strings or numbers. Let's just do strings. We'll just do code chunks. And then I want to add another value to this list. Is add a comma. So, and then we just make a new line. That's not necessary. You can all do this all in one line too. That's totally okay. Let's just add Emily, I guess. And we can do John. And then we can do Robert. And that's that. That's how you add items to, or that's how you create an array, rather. There's different methods available to access the properties of an array, or add items to an array, or delete them. But I'm not really going to go into those because that's a whole video on its own. But you can go to the documentation, and I'll link that down in the description below. But that's what arrays are in JavaScript. And so if you want to access items within an array, it gets kind of funky if you're not familiar with programming. So let's just do a new console.log, okay? We'll do list of names. Now, list of names will just have the entire array. Say I want to access the first item in the array, which is code chunks. In programming, at least in most programming languages, the first item in an array is at something called the 0 index. Index is just the the position, I guess, if you will, of an item in an array. So you can think of it as, code chunks is at the first position, Emily's at second, etc. But you always want to subtract one. So code chunks is the first item, the first position in the array, but the index of that is 0 because all arrays, at least in most programming languages, start at index of 0. So the way you access the first item in an array is you have the array name of the variable, okay? Then you do open close square brackets, and then you type 0. And that's that, okay? If we run this, go back and we go to our desktop. Run this, see, it prints out the first item in the list of names. In this case, it's code chunks. We want to access the second item, which is that first index. We save this, we rerun that file, and now you see Emily's printed. And I think you get the idea. That's pretty much how arrays work in JavaScript. Okay, so last thing I want to talk about real quick is const variables. So const test is equal to test, okay? That's that. Test is equal set to test. When we try to set test to 1, 2, 3, we try to change the value of the test variable, we should see an error. So if I go here, run the file again, see it throws an error, assignment to constant variable, okay? Now that's because the constant variable is set to a string, and this will also happen if it's set to a number, or an array, or a string, or a boolean. Now it gets a little funky when you set a const to an object. So let's just set const to an object, this test variable to an object. If you remember, right, the syntax is this. Okay, so you have 2 curly braces, open close, do name, colon, code, chunks. Okay, and then let's just add an age to 41. Okay, we can rename this test to person. Okay, so here's our object. Our person object has a name and an age. Okay, name is set to code chunks, age is set to 41. And let's just add a new console.log. We do person.name. Okay, when we print this, when we run this file, we should see code chunks printed. Let me just show you real quick. Go here, and then we do node variables. Okay, code chunks. All right, that looks good. That looks correct. Now, here's what we can do with a constant variable that's set to an object. We can do person.name is equal to John Doe. Okay, now let's just copy that console log. Okay, so we should see code chunks first printed, and then we should see John Doe printed. Now, that's a little weird, right? I think so too, but it'll still happen, and I'll tell you why. Alright, so see, John Doe. And you're probably thinking, hey, you said that objects, constant variables rather, shouldn't be changed. Now you're right, but JavaScript is weird. The way they implemented this is not as expected. So that's just a gotcha. Something you should keep your eye out for is that if you have an object that's set to a const, you can still change the properties of that object. Now you can't actually set person to a new object, right? So if I were to set person equal to just an empty object, for example, it should yell at us. Yeah, okay, yeah, see, because it's not a new, or it is a new object that I'm trying to set it to. But when I try to set a property of that object to something else, then it does let me do that. So that's variables and types for you in JavaScript. Obviously, this is just a brief introduction can include everything that has to do with variables and types in JavaScript, but I'll make sure to include the reference documentation in the description down below. Make sure to play around with this on your own time to get a better understanding, better feeling of how variables and types work in JavaScript. Please make sure to like and subscribe. Leave a comment down below if there's something you didn't like or that you did like, something you want me to make a video about, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.